Okay, and so before we do another round of homework problems, let's just review something we saw from section 1.3, and that is the positiveness and the negativeness of our sine, cosine, tangent, etc. So for what angles is sine positive or negative, right? For what angles is cosine positive or negative? Lots to remember here, but hopefully if we just remember the definition and our location, we can piece it together rather easily. And then what I'm going to approach it was, I think it's easier to remember where everything's positive, and then by default everything would be negative from there. So first off, in quad 1's a very nice quadrant, because in this quadrant our x is positive, our y is positive, and then as we've seen, by definition, r is always positive. All right, since it's the distance my ordered pair is from the origin. So in this case, everything's positive. So it doesn't matter what ratio I use. A positive divided by a positive is a positive. A positive divided by a positive is a positive. A positive divided by a positive is a positive. So, and then these guys would follow suit since they're essentially reciprocals. So everyone's positive. So that's the nice quadrant to work in. Everybody, no matter what angle we do from 0 to 90 degrees, right, everybody, right, is going to give out a positive ratio. What about quad 2? Okay, so here's where things start to get interesting, because in this quadrant, our x is now negative, right? Our y coordinate is still positive, and r is always positive. So when we look at what goes on here, right, anything that involves x, right, since everybody's positive except x is going to make everybody negative. So, right, we have a negative divided by a positive, so cosine's negative, right? We have a positive divided by a negative, secant is negative. We have a positive divided by a negative, tangent would be negative. And we have a negative divided by a positive, so cotangent would be negative. But over here, we have a positive over a positive. So it might be best to remember, right, that in this quadrant, sine theta and its reciprocal cosecant theta, right, these guys are the ones that are positive. So that means by default, the other four are negative, all right? Or you just kind of fall back on that definition, put your thinking caps on, and kind of think about it. So this now means that in quad 2, if our angle has a terminal side between 90 and 180 degrees, right, sine and cosine are the only guys that are happy in that quadrant. They're positive. Everybody else is sad and they're negative. All right, so that's what happens when we keep going into the next quadrant. What about quad number 3? Well, in this quadrant, what we take notice is x is now negative, y is also negative, and r is always going to be positive. So in this quadrant, what's going to happen is sine, right, since it's a negative number divided by a positive, will be negative. Positive divided by a negative, this will be negative. Negative divided by positive, this will be negative. Positive divided by negative, this would be negative. But then the tangent's going to be really happy, right, because we're taking a negative value and a negative value, right? Remember, they're both negative. And a negative divided by a negative is a positive. So in this quadrant, tangent of theta, and then it's reciprocal, right, because we still have a negative divided by a negative, so cotangent of theta, these two guys are the ones that are happy in that quadrant. So tangent and its cotangent is reciprocal. Those are the two happy functions in quad 3. Of course, by default, that means the other four are sad. They're going to be all negative because their ratio involves a negative and a positive somehow. All right, and so moving right along, I think you can almost see by default, if you look at what's remaining, right, we've sine and cosecant are happy in this quadrant, tangent and cotangent are happy in this quadrant. So by default, who do you think's over here? All right, if you're thinking cosine of theta and secant of theta, you are right. But let's see why, right? So again, in this quadrant, in quad 4, right, in this quadrant, my x is positive, my y is negative in this quadrant, and r is always positive. So we go look at the ratios, right? Now, right, we have a negative divided by a positive, so sine's negative. We have a positive divided by a negative, so cosecant is negative. Tangent, well, we have a negative over a positive, so negative. And we have a positive over a negative, so cotangent is going to be negative. And what's nice about cosine and secant? Well, in this quadrant, x is positive and so is r. So positive divided by a positive is positive. And same thing here. So in this one, cosine and secant are going to be positive. All right, and so this is going to have an impact on graphs and some things that we're going to see in the near future and in the far future. But try to start to memorize that fact about the sign values, positiveness or negativeness of our trig functions depending on where we're at. And again, I actually think if you just remember the trig definition along with where am I at, who's positive and who's negative, you can't go wrong. You can always kind of build that knowledge base back up in case you forget. Or again, everybody's positive, right? Sine and cosecant are only positive in quad 2. Tangent and cotangent are the only ones positive in quad 3. And cosecant and secant are only positive in quad number 4. And that might be a quick reference. Alrighty? So now that we have that reviewed and took a look at it in some really good detail, let's go take a look at some homework problems.